Good morning. Welcome to University Baptist Church, to our continuing study of 1 Peter. We've been having a lot of fun, I hope you have. I know Will and I have been enjoying ourselves. But this has been a really interesting deep dive into this short epistle. And some of you may be surprised at how long we've been able to take going through 1 Peter and may wonder if we're going to pick up the pace a little bit or not. But I think at this point it looks like we're going to just continue this pace of going through and seeing what this short epistle has to say to us for today. I'm so glad that you've chosen to join us. You could be doing anything this morning, and I'm glad that you've jumped on to Facebook or YouTube and that you're here with us as we continue looking at 1 Peter. If you want to get the handout and haven't had a chance to get it yet, you can go to universitybaptist.org/live and download the handout for today. Otherwise, you shouldn't have any trouble following along. We're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're looking at the verses 16 through 25. 16 and 17 sort of connect with what just came before, and then 18 to 25 pick up this new thought and continue moving the idea forward. But as we get ready to move into this passage, I'd just like to thank you again for joining us. I'm kind of giving everybody a little bit of a chance to get their Bibles and their coffee and get ready to look at 1 Peter. But as we get ready to start, would you join me in prayer? God, you can speak to us through so many ways. The great theologian Karl Barth said, you can speak through a flute concerto, or a shrub, or even Russian communism. He tried to pick an outlandish example just to show how you can communicate to us. Your word can get to us if we open ourselves to you. Today, Lord, we look to you and seek to hear your voice in 1 Peter. And we ask that you would open our hearts, open our minds, and help us be available to you for your voice to reach us and talk to us where we are and whatever we are encountering. So now, Lord, open our minds, open our hearts, and speak to us through these verses of your Bible. Amen.
Right. Well, this week we're continuing where we started last week, and as you remember, last week we looked at these verses that talked about accepting the authority of every human institution, whether that's emperors and governors, and we had a good discussion about what that would mean and how some places in the New Testament it seems to say all these authorities are from God, listen to what they say. Other places we see those same disciples and apostles that said those things resisting those authorities or being killed by those authorities, and so we kind of wrestled with that a little bit. And today the wrestling is going to continue because we get to some verses that are controversial, might be a word you could use, or challenging. Words that have a long history that's not always a good history. And so I think this would be a good conversation for us today, because today we look at some verses that tell slaves to accept the authority of their masters. And we're going to need to talk about that and what that means in that context, in our context. What could this mean for us? Such a different time and place. A lot to think about here, a lot to continue. And with all of this, what is the purpose behind these words? What are we supposed to learn? What does it mean about being aliens and exiles? How's that related to this? How does this relate to accepting the authority of human institutions? And so we've got a lot to see today as we go through these verses, and I'm glad you're joining with us, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say in the comments here on YouTube and Facebook. We'll be reading those regularly as we go through, and would love to hear your comments and questions or thoughts or things that bother you about this, things you like about this, insights you've had on the fly, or something you read a long time ago. Whatever you want to share with us, please do. It's great to have that conversation going. But why don't we begin by just reading through the passage that we'll be looking at today. We'll read 16 and 17 and then all the way down to verse 25, so the end of chapter 2. So I'll just go ahead and read that for us, and then we can start with those first couple verses. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that, free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. All right. Well, good. Well, now that we kind of have that all in our ears, and it's interesting to hear all of that because we can't talk about the first few verses without realizing what comes next, and to hear, oh, we're going to get into Christ and Christ's suffering, and that's going to somehow relate back to this. But why don't we start with those first couple verses, 16 and 17. We, in some ways, they fit with last week's section, but they also fit with today's section. They really kind of bridge us in between these two. And so let's just look at those again. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. And this word, this servants of God, that it says in verse 16, that word servants could also be translated slaves. And so in a sense, this could say, as slaves of God, live as free people. And so I think as a first question we have on the handout there, if we're described as both servants or slaves and free people, how is that true? And I mean, this is a big, broad question, of course, about freedom and what does it mean to be free and how do we use our freedom? So I would love to hear any thoughts you have about that. Can we be both free people and servants of God and slaves of God? And if we are slaves of God, does that mean we are not free? So, I would love to hear what you have to say about that or any opening thoughts or questions. But maybe in the meantime, we can sort of start the conversation as we wait for things to pick up here.
So in verse 16 and 17, where it talks about being servants of God, as servants of God, 16, the word there, and this is an interesting distinction because we don't get this nuance in the English. Doulos is the Greek that's used there for servants. And in the following verse 18, when it says slaves, it uses it's a synonym in Greek, right, but it's a different word. I know it's based on oikos because that's household. Oiketes, which is household slave. And so just as a sort of a teaser for when we move into verse 18 in a second, they are synonyms, but there's a shift taking place. And that's part of this epistle theology. One of the things as we prepared this week, we've had these 5 themes kind of arcing over our conversation: God, Christ, suffering, baptism, and life in exile. And coming into this section, 16 to 25, we have God, Christ, suffering, and life in exile. And as sort of the themes that come out here. Being a servant of God is a challenge because whether we're a servant or a slave of God, it means that we're putting something else ahead of us.
Yes, and so and it's interesting. Does that mean that we are still free, or are we in freedom choosing to put ourselves under, which is a distinction to make there. And I think we'll constantly be making distinctions between, when we hear slavery, we think of slavery in the U.S. and what that meant and how that looked. And if this is saying be a slave of God, we don't
And this
parallel with that exactly.
Yeah, exactly. In this commentary by James Elliott that I've been referring to throughout this series, he writes, believers are to exercise their freedom by choosing to do what is right rather than using their liberty as a pretext for evil, because they're also slaves of God and subject ultimately to God's will. So we have this both immediacy and eternal I in 1 Peter, and both live alongside one another. This is an epistle that recognizes we're in the world, we're here, we're living, there's something here that we have to deal with, but there is something next. And both of these are coexistent all the time. And that's, I think, also a struggle, because we wrestle with what does it mean to have an eye toward eternity? Sort of many years ago, when sort of green theology or eco-theology was sort of just coming in, I remember hearing somebody justifying not worrying about the environment because it was sort of, there's an eternity and this world isn't God's world anyway, so we can, drive whatever we want to drive, have coal-fired power plants, all those things, because this world doesn't matter. And I think that what we see in 1 Peter is this world does matter. What happens here is important.
Yeah, and our conduct, our choices make a difference here. And so maybe that's a good place for us to start with this. And as we're thinking about, are we free? Are we servants or slaves? And well, of course, both of those things.
Right.
That we do have decisions, even within whatever system we're in, we have choices about how we behave. And I think that's part of what 1 Peter is driving home toward is, what are you going to do with your freedom?
This is something that you've talked about a fair amount, and so I hope that I can tee it up enough that you'll see what I'm pointing at. But how does 1 Peter talk about the pandemic?
Well, not specifically.
Well, in a way, though.
But in a way, and this concept of exiles and aliens, I think, is part of it. And certainly one of our themes that we keep going around is that this is not your home, sort of thing. This is not the way it's going to be. And so we've talked about that a lot. But about also, the choices that we get to make. And so in our freedom, we get to do certain things. And so for the pandemic,
right,
we did not choose this institution, this situation,
right,
but we can choose how we respond to it. And we can do things, whether that's staying home and wearing a mask, right, all the little things that we can do. We do those things, and so we can't change the larger thing, right, but to use the language of accept, which comes up a lot here, we can, right, accept that as it is and respond accordingly. Right. And so I think maybe that's where we get kind of our freedom on the one hand, but it's freedom within a certain situation. And so perhaps Peter is framing this all as you have freedom, and yet it is within this larger context of being a servant of God. And so a servant of God will direct your freedom and will, I don't want to say constrain exactly, as more as point it in a certain direction. And so we have freedom to do that.
Maybe instead of constrain, encourage, yeah, provide justification, which we get into, yeah, in verse 21. But, it's sort of that, if this 1 Peter, if this letter was framed to this moment, it would be, you can wear a mask. You are free to do that. Yeah, the most salient recent news example might be the encouragement or the edict to churches go ahead and reopen when we're free not to. We're free to say, no, another voice in government authority said, safer at home. And we're free to follow that wisdom.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we can bring a couple of comments in here. I see a couple folks have chimed in on the conversation here. We have Ed Lowry mentioned that God, on Facebook, that God endowed us with free will. We exercise that free will in choosing to be His servants. We could, of course, use that freedom errantly, and often do, but we are admonished to use it wisely. And Debbie Johnson picked up from there and said that her translation says, do not use your freedom to do evil. And that's a good way to say it. We have our freedom that we can use. And so use it for good. Use that to choose to be God's servants, and use that not to do evil.
Over on YouTube, we've got a couple of comments. Elizabeth Mulcahy writes, "We all live in the reality that is God's will, but within this context, we have the freedom to deny or believe, do good or evil."
Yeah.
And that's that choice. We can live in such a way that reflects our lives as servants of God, or we can live in a way that points to us serving something else, ourselves, or society, or culture, or consumerism, or whatever. But Larry Johnson writes, "Following social distancing guidelines respects other people, giving up our freedom to the government authority, or maybe both at the same time."
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, if the governmental authority says, please wear a mask, and we do, are we giving up our freedom in doing that? And I think we hear a lot of the folks that are saying not to wear a mask or not to do it, saying, well, I have freedom not to do this. And of course we do have freedom. We have freedom to make those choices. And I think perhaps that both at the same time kind of gets at our motivations as well. Are we doing this for the sake of others, or are we doing this because we were told to, or is this an act of love on our part to say this helps protect you? So I'm not going to go out and go shopping yet, or go out
or minimize.
Go to I'm going to, as much as possible, do things safely. And
I heard on the radio on the way to the church this morning a public health expert talking about calculating the risk of each social contact, and so and specifically it was talking about haircuts, which incidentally made me tune in a little bit because I'm in need of a haircut. And the public health expert said, is that where you want your social contact risk to be? And what I was hearing is, we can minimize our contact. We can eliminate it as much as possible, but we can minimize it. But as you sort of start to widen those circles, where do you want that contact to be? And is it really worth going into a barbershop and exposing yourself to all of the other people there? And just to take a wider view just for a second, when we do a Bible study like this and we start to talk so much about current events and what's happening right now in our world, it might seem like we're trying to fit the text to what's happening, or fit the text to say something. I would take the opposite view. I would say that this is the work of exegesis, and exegesis just means interpretation, bringing the meaning out of the text. And as Will was talking about, what does it mean to be a servant or a slave of God, a slave of Christ? That's the work of exegesis, because now we're asking the questions that connect freedom with submission to authority. Which is it? Do we have this freedom to do what we want, or are we submitting to authority to God's authority in our freedom? And so once we start to reframe the question, we're not taking the meaning off the page, but we're trying to find out what the text is saying to us today. One of the things that the Bible does is points to revelation. So we have God revealing God's self in the world. The Bible isn't revelation. The Bible is sort of the shadow of revelation. It points to revelation. So as we get into the text, we can see God revealed. And that's one of these large themes, God, in this book. But as we look at the meaning, then we can say this is what it's talking about. And that's where I was pointing back to what Will's talked about before, about these choices we make. And this very much fits with the theme, because we're not wrestling with what slavery in Rome looked like. Mm-hmm. That's just, it's not a part of the issues that we face today. So what are the issues we face today? Because it's talking about the issues those folks faced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's aimed at, yes. So in this context where you are,
right,
how do you live appropriately? How do you live a Christian life in the midst of that? And that next verse 17, honor everyone, love the family of believers,
Right.
fear God, honor the emperor.
Right.
I mean, you got these little short sentences that really sum up a lot of this, what we said as well. And things like wearing a mask and social distancing and all
Very
that.
clear.
Is partly to love other people,
Right.
is to honor everyone. And it is very clear, and it's helpful sometimes to refine it down to a two-word sentence.
Yeah.
Honor everyone.
In honoring authority, whether it's the emperor or a governor or the federal government, there are ways to engage with the authority in an honorable way. Mm-hmm. And that's really important, because it doesn't say blindly follow the emperor.
Right, right, and I think throughout history there have always been folks who, and presidents switch parties back and forth,
Sure.
and so every time there are folks saying, "I love this country, and that's why I'm going to speak out and say this is wrong."
Right.
And say I think we are better than this, or I think we could be better than this,
Right.
and for whatever situation it is, and I think it's helpful to say that there are ways to honor and to accept the authorities that are, while also not saying, okay, well, I guess I have to do whatever they say. It's like, well, sometimes honoring is also being respectful, speaking clearly and thoughtfully, but sometimes that is also speaking up against. So.
And if we move into 18 to 20, we get into a very concrete situation. And that was the reason why I brought out the distinction between doulos, oniketes, because now it's moved from slave of God, doulos, to oiketes, which is like, hey, this is a real situation.
Yes, and it's sort of household in the house. And,
yes.
And these sections are called household codes. We have
Right.
this in several different letters, and which makes sense in some ways. If you're going to talk about this ethics, and this is not just in the Bible, these other philosophers at the time had household codes, because it's one thing to have this grand theory of how people should behave in life, and that's great. But where does that come into play? Well, where are you spending your time? How does it come into your day-to-day life? What does that look like at home? And so we have a household code. What does your grand ethics look like? Okay, you've played this beautiful vision. How about with your spouse and with your family, and in this time with slaves?
So sometimes it's helpful just jumping back and forth. We were talking about current events just a second ago, but let's jump now back into first century Palestine, and let's talk about the Roman world and what slavery looked like in the Roman world. And if you'll bear with me just for a second, I want to just share some background on this, including sort of the numbers. Slaves in the period of the Roman imperial rule formed the major part of the empire's labor force and the basis of what they called a slave economy. Rome alone was home to 5 to 6 million free citizens and about 1 to 2 million slaves. Slaves had no freedom. They were ipso facto disqualified from citizenship. So Pax Romana, peace in Rome, the claims of a Roman citizen, none of that applied to slaves. They had no civil rights. They could neither marry nor bear legitimate children, nor were there any legal limits on the punishment that could be inflicted upon them by their owners. And so they were treated as chattel. It was a terrible situation to be a slave in Rome. Now, Israelite legislation appears to have been designed to give slaves some minimal forms of protection. They were sort of, if you look back in Leviticus, they were treated more like wage-earning guests. That still isn't a situation you want to be in, but it's different than the Roman slave world. And so this text sort of coexists with that Israelite slavery legislation, because that would have been common in the area around Jerusalem. But once you get over into Asia Minor and to a lot of the, Ephesus and Corinth and places in that area, there's more of a mix between the Israelite world and the Roman world. The number of domestic slaves, and this is the last bit of history, in a typical household varied from 1 or 2 in families. So if you were just a family with a slave or 2, and had simple means, to you could have as many as 400 in wealthy households. And there's a story of a freed slave who made good because he had 4,000 slaves, and the imperial household had as many as 20,000 slaves. So that's the background. When we read this, slaves accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. This would be a bitter pill. This would be a pretty difficult word to hear. And so maybe the exercise and interpretation, and then I want to get into some of these questions, because I liked this idea of, does this conversation make you uncomfortable? But if we want to try to see what is the meaning, what it would be the harshest word that we might hear from Peter or from Jesus today? What would be something that would just slap us in the face? Because if you are one of these slaves and you've decided you want to be a Christ follower, and now it says, accept the authority of your master, even the ones that are harsh. That's tough. It's really tough.
Yeah, and and to into that first question of, does this make you uncomfortable? Spoiler alert, yes, it makes me uncomfortable. And,
it should.
And I think it should, and especially, for two white men like us to stand here and knowing that preachers like us in churches like this have used passages like this one, including this one, to justify slavery in the U.S., right? To say, look, it says in the Bible, accept the authority of your masters, even if they're abusive. I mean, this is not a hypothetical in our country. And I think we have to acknowledge that when we read a text like this, to say, we as Christians have used these verses very badly to do terrible things. And
did you, when you were reading this, and I mean, I know you weren't reading the same background I was, but when I was going through this background, I was thinking, like, my mind immediately thought about my my family of origin, and it never dawned on me that I would be in the slave class.
Right. And I think that's another big challenge for us as we read these things. Who is this verse written to? And I think the people that were if we go back 100 years, 200 years to the white Christian preachers who were using this to justify slavery, it was the slaveholders using it.
Sure.
And this is addressed to the slaves, and I think it's easy for us to kind of answer your question. My family background is not the slave side of the U.S. history, right? I think it should make us uncomfortable.
But the question you just asked, I think it really makes sense. What if this was actually written to the slave masters, the slave owners, to say, I'd rather be the good and just owner. Like, it's sort of like the preaching prayer. We want to say something, so we tell God, everybody else gets to hear it.
Yeah.
But in this, absolutely, it should make us uncomfortable. And there are probably innumerable verses that have been misused over time. And using this to justify slavery would be an absolute misappropriation, even at the time.
Yeah.
And there were abolitionists in the North, in the U.S., if we're just situating this in the U.S. in our own context, there would have been abolitionists who would have said, this is not a tacit endorsement of slavery. Yeah.
There were, absolutely, there were. So I think it is important for us to read responsibly and thoughtfully. And at the same time, I think it's okay for us to push back a little bit on passages like this, because while it does not endorse slavery as the way things should be, it also doesn't say there should be no slavery. And I mean, it sort of takes it for granted. And I think it's okay for that to make us uncomfortable too, because I want it to say something like, slavery is terrible and all people are free and should be let free, but even though this isn't the case right now, you can do the best you can in it, but this is not what God wants for the world. I want it to say that, and it doesn't. And I think it's okay for us to push back on the Bible a little bit too, to say, I wish it had said a little more there, or I wish it had been a little more clear there that you're accepting the authority of this human institution, even if this human institution is wrong.
The subversion that you're looking for is present, but it's subtle. Not in this verse. I'll grant you there.
Yes,
but
yes.
That's kind of subversive message. It's sort of ever present as a stream running through, and maybe I'm letting the biblical authors off the hook a little bit, but I attribute that to continuing the conversation, wanting people to be able to keep listening, keep chewing on it, because if your listeners lack the capacity to process and understand what you say, it really doesn't matter what you say. And once you stop the conversation, you stop all progress moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think, and that's part of how we have to read these carefully, is to read in context and especially with the person of Jesus, who resisted and was subversive in his own way, but not in the way people wanted him to be, outright saying the Roman authority is unjust, but kind of showing it differently.
Well, and not, this is by no means a book plug, but in my book that just came out, Crossing the Lines We Draw, it would be a book plug if I had one here to hold up. But that's really the question that I wrestle with throughout the book, because it's about polarization in our country right now, sort of written mostly 2017-ish, 18. So when it came into print just a month ago, I had hoped that it wouldn't necessarily still be relevant, but unfortunately it is, and we continue this quest. I see we have a question from Jim Moore, or maybe it's a comment. So here is the radical effect of Christianity, the concept that all humans own and are responsible for their own souls. Do you want to take a swing at commenting?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I mean, I think that's another kind of subversion of this, to say, for one thing, just that Peter is addressing the slaves and saying, I'm going to talk to you, and here's this institution that dehumanizes you, that says you are owned by someone else,
right,
which thus means you are kind of worthless. And
but you have agency. Yeah,
but you have agency, you can make choices, you can do these things. And also you have your own relationship with God, and your soul does not belong to whoever owns you in this system.
Right.
You can't really be owned by anyone. And so to talk about that person's relationship with God, as if that slavery stuff doesn't even matter, is pretty radical and subversive itself. Yeah. So thanks, Jim. That's helpful.
This is a challenging passage, and we're going to get into some more challenging words in 1 Peter when we get to chapter 3. Somebody asked me recently, are you all going to skip over the beginning of chapter 3? And I said, absolutely not. That's next week, and I think it's got something to say to us even for today. But before we can move into that, we have this justification. We get into this, in verse 25, is connected with what came before. Verse 21 is connected to verses 18 to 20 because it opens with this line, for to this you have been called. For to this you have been called. So we get through 19 and 20 talking about the credit that it is to your credit, being aware of God, if you endure pain. But then when we get into verse 21, here's the reason you've got this calling. And then there's a justification. And it's the motivation for the exhortation that came before it. And this is a pattern that comes up again in 1 Peter. There's an exhortation, and then we get the motivation. So the question that I think is so appropriate is, what does Jesus' suffering teach us? What does Jesus' example teach us about suffering?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it is beautiful, and it's challenging as well. This thinking about suffering in this way that is not exactly celebrated, but it shows Jesus suffering. And sorry, we're going to just quick distraction in the room for a second. So we have Jesus suffering, and it talks about how Jesus does not return abuse when he's suffered. He bore his sins on the cross so that free from sins we might live lives for righteousness. And so we have Jesus' example for us. And as we were describing just a minute ago, how in relation to slavery, how this can be sort of resisting, but by suffering, Jesus somehow turns that suffering upside down, where people are inflicting punishment on him, and yet he endures that and transforms it. And so maybe that transformation is part of what we're looking at here as we think about these things, that what happens to us is transformed when we use our agency to make the best of that situation, or to work within that situation, or to respond faithfully in that. It somehow makes those other actions happening to us less important or have a less significance, because we are taking the agency for ourselves, and we are transforming that suffering. So we have another comment. Alba Beasley mentioned, should we live as if we are owned by God? And that follows up nicely from where we were just a moment ago, to live in that certain way, as if we are owned by God. And I think that connects back, of course, to verse 16, where we are all servants of God. Let me read what Charlotte Bailey wrote here on YouTube. Doesn't slavery take different forms, such as employer-employee, loaner-loanee, parent and child? Isn't it relationship-based? And that's helpful too, I think. So often we think of slavery and go directly to large-scale, you either are a slave or a free person, and yet verse 16 they translated it servants, and there is something. Perhaps there are lots of ways in which you're in relationships that have power dynamics, and sometimes we are at the top of that dynamic, sometimes we are on the bottom of that dynamic, and sometimes it's side by side.
That's a really good point to bring up, because the point is power dynamics. Mm-hmm. I think that it's so easy to, once we take a hard look at the context and we look at what slavery meant in the first century, when we then try to make sense of it, we can either look back 150 years and say, this is one of those uncomfortable passages that has been misappropriated to justify, the African slave trade. Mm-hmm. That's wrong, and that's where we really want it to say more. But what if there's something deeper going on? What if it's more about the power dynamics between those who have authority and those who either are subject through circumstances or even just through their own perception? They feel like they are subject to this authority. And it could be anything, parent, child, employer, employee, like Charlotte mentioned. Mm-hmm. There's a struggle there. And so if we can resituate it in power dynamics, what does it say? And this is a teaser a little bit for when we get into spouses next week. Live in such a way that your life is an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that connects it, because all this is connected together. Last week, accept the authority of every human institution. Today, slaves, accept the authority of your masters. And next week, when we get to wives, accept the authority of your husbands. I mean, there's all this accepting the authority of these systems, right, and then doing something within them. And that doing something is really the point of it.
Right.
It doesn't stop with that first sentence, accept the authority. There's always a so that, and in order that, a reason, and a what's happening in the midst of this. And I think that's really helpful to look at those power dynamics and to say, okay, how do we work within these situations that we're in where those dynamics don't come to define us, right, but we find our agency within them? And I think that's a really faithful way to read this passage.
Dean Tennant commented also on this about the acceptance of authority, and it is a broad metaphor for suffering. And I like that widening. Mm-hmm. When we're suffering, we must accept that it is inevitable and continue to follow God. I'm not sure I'd go all the way with you on inevitable, Dean, but I think that we can definitely agree that suffering exists. And so, because if we accept it as inevitable, then there can be the next conclusion that I can't do anything about it. And so it sort of lets us off the hook a little bit for fighting for justice. But if we say there will be suffering, so we don't have to beat our heads against the wall, but we can still work against, to fight against the existence of suffering. And when there is suffering, or when we are suffering, we should continue to follow God. And your reading almost turns this into a word of encouragement, or it very much turns it into a word of encouragement. Slaves, obey your masters. Continue to do what is right. Continue to do good. Continue to do good work. Don't resent, don't subvert, but try to win over. And that goes back to there's always a connection. Mm-hmm. Jack brings up the hymn, I know no other master.
Yeah, that's interesting, Jack, saying that the slave has a secret. I may belong, in quotes, to a human master, but I voluntarily am a slave of Jesus. And so there's something deeper than the realities that seem so defining and important. And,
right.
And I think that's really what's going on here, that this situation of slavery in the Roman world is just so taken for granted.
Right.
And we could name all sorts of things that are just taken for granted today that are spoken about without comment. Some people speak different languages from each other. Some people are citizens and some are not. Some people live in different countries. I mean, there are just things that are the way the world is. And I think that was it. Without value judgment on, this is just the world people lived in. Just the same way that there were wives and husbands in the next chapter. Mm-hmm. It's just spoken as a fact of life. And so I think while we can and should say, this in no way says slavery is okay, and we cannot be okay with slavery in any of its forms, including modern forms of slavery today around the world. I mean, we should say those things. And we should also say, okay, within our situation as it is, what can we learn and how can we use our agency within these systems?
And we've brought up some really good questions about the wider lens. So Will was just talking about what else do we take for granted? Mm-hmm. And then how do we take it for granted? Dean talked about the nature of suffering and sort of what does this passage say to us about the nature of suffering. We talked about power relationships. We talked about agency and the way that we have freedom. We talked about who is in the authority. Jack's point about the slaves having a secret. All of this from these three verses that really seemed to, at the surface level, are just uncomfortable. They're just, and that's why so often passages like this, Phyllis Tribble, an Old Testament scholar, wrote a very short book called Texts of Terror. And she addresses some of those passages that are just horrible and tries to make sense of them. This wouldn't necessarily reach that level as a text of terror, but it's one of those uncomfortable passages that can elicit the kind of question that somebody asked me about the beginning of chapter 3, where, are you going to skip that? I'd much rather get to the part about Jesus knew about suffering, so therefore you're in a relationship with God. And if we minimize our faith to a soft, fuzzy, sort of feel-good assurance, sort of, what is the phrase, fire insurance against hell or something like that. Yeah. If it's just that, then what difference does it make? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if it's worth the work, if it's worth trying to dig, and that's what, in the comments today, I mean, even with the interruption to come and go, in the comments, seeing this conversation, this is the kind of work that can make a passage like this even more meaningful than some of the softer, fluffier ones. Yeah,
there's a lot here, and it's worth getting a little uncomfortable to go into these. I agree. We're almost out of time, so please be putting up your last thoughts before we finish up here. Lynn Martin said, because we are Christians, we are called to handle unjust treatment in a Christ-like way. Mm-hmm. That's really well put, just to kind of encapsulate that. And we see that here for the instruction for slaves to endure the abuse and that they will get God's approval. There's something empowering about that too, to say, even though this situation that you're in is terrible and doesn't seem like it's going to change, God sees you, God sees your suffering, and God will, whether that God will reward you for it, whether we go to that phrasing of it, but handle that in a Christ-like way, as Lynn says. And I think maybe just one other point about that, it's always challenging to know not to be passive about these things. You mentioned that when Dean said suffering is inevitable. And of course, suffering is inevitable in all of our lives, right? But the specific types of suffering we see, if we just say, yes, of course, people suffer, then we could just kind of sit back.
Right.
Say, oh, well,
it's the way it is.
100,000 people have died from this coronavirus. Sorry, that's just the way it is.
Right.
No, we can do some things about this.
Right.
And so, even though this is addressed to the people suffering, and so I think that helps avoid that passivity when it's like, oh, just endure the suffering. It's like, well, that's for the person who is powerless being afflicted by it, to say, you can endure this in a Christ-like way. That's not telling all the people that are around watching, observing, that may have power to help, well, suffering's just how it is. And that's a stretch. That's reading that the wrong way. So I think we should be careful that, when we are powerless and suffering, endure the best we can, find our agency in that. But if we have the ability to do something to help the suffering of others, we shouldn't just accept it as the way it is.
Right.
Then we can get in there and intervene. And that's also loving the family of believers, honoring everyone, all these things.
Do you want to close this out?
Sure. I'll just read the last comment from Raynell. Suffering is part of the Christian calling, for it serves the purpose of making the believer more Christ-like.
Right.
That's helpful too, that suffering is part of our journey, part of our calling, part of our experience, and through suffering, we become more Christ-like. So, lots to say there, and this conversation really will continue next week, because as we go into next week, we'll be looking at chapter 3 and how this continues accepting the authority of another human institution, and what does that mean? And so please come back and join us next week as we go into chapter 3. I look forward to hearing what you have to say there. But for now, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. We'll be back here in about 28 minutes to start our worship service. Hope you'll join us again then as we worship together. But let me close us out with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this challenging passage that we wrestle with sometimes, that we squirm in our seats a little bit sometimes, and yet also a passage that speaks to us and teaches us when we really dig and listen. So thank you for the ways that your Spirit speaks through each one of us as we have this conversation. Thank you for each person that's participated in this, wherever we each may be. Be with us now as we go from this time. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank
See you
you
in a
all.
bit.
See you next time.
See you in a little bit.